The first snow of the season came not with a roar but with a whisper, dusting the high plains in a fine white powder that clung to the brittle stalks of last summer's grass. Jacob watched it from the cabin window, his breath fogging the glass in a small, transient circle. For 10 years, winter had been a season of profound silence, a time when the world outside mirrored the frozen stillness within him. The cold was a familiar ache, a constant companion that settled deep in his bones, much like the memory of his wife. Lynn had loved the first snow. She would press her hands to this same window pane, her dark eyes wide with a wonder he had never quite understood, but had cherished nonetheless. Now the house was just a container for his solitude, each floorboard holding the echo of her lighter footsteps, each gust of wind against the eaves sounding like a sigh he could no longer hear. He had built this life with her, plank by plank, promise by promise, and when the sickness took her, it had taken the architect of his world, leaving him to wander the empty rooms of their creation. The silence was heaviest in the evenings, when the fire crackled in the hearth and cast dancing shadows on the walls. He would eat his stew alone at the long wooden table they had sanded down together, his own shadow a hulking, solitary shape. The chair opposite him remained empty, a void that was more present than any object. He had long ago stopped expecting to see her there, but he had never stopped feeling her absence. It was a phantom limb, a pain for something no longer attached. The days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a pale winter sun and the needs of the few cattle he kept. The work was hard and honest, grounding him in the physical world when his mind threatened to drift into the fog of memory. He mended fences, chopped wood, and tended his animals with a methodical rhythm that left little room for thought. But in the quiet moments, she returned, her scent on a quilt folded in the chest at the foot of their bed, the faint outline of her teacup on the shelf, the ghost of her laughter and the rustle of dry leaves. Tonight the snow was falling faster, the flakes growing fat and heavy. It was the kind of snow that promised to lock the world away. He turned from the window, the firelight catching the weary lines around his eyes. He was not an old man, but grief had aged him in ways the sun and wind never could. He was about to add another log to the fire when a sound cut through the howl of the rising wind. A sharp, distinct rap on the front door. He froze. No one came out this far. Not in good weather, and certainly not with a storm blowing in. He listened again, thinking it was just a branch, or the wind playing tricks. It came again. Firmer this time, insistent, a sound so alien in his decade of isolation that it felt like a hammer blow against the fragile peace of his solitude. He moved slowly, his hand resting instinctively on the worn handle of the axe leaning by the door, before he dismissed the thought. He drew the heavy bolt, the metal groaning in protest, and pulled the door inward. The wind tore at the opening, flinging a swirl of snow into the room that hissed against the warmth of the fire. And in the swirling white, she stood. For a disorienting second, his heart seized, convinced he was seeing a ghost. She had Lynn's eyes, the same dark almond shape that held a universe of unspoken thoughts, the same fall of black hair now dusted with snow, the same delicate curve of her jaw. But she was younger, her face unlined by the hardships of this land, and she was taller by a hand's breadth. She wore a simple beige prairie dress, the fabric too thin for such a bitter night. A small, worn valise held tightly in her gloved hands. Her gaze met his, and it was steady, carrying a mixture of fear and resolve that was entirely her own. He could only stare, the cold air rushing past him. The word he wanted to say, Lynn's name, caught in his throat like a shard of ice. She shivered, not just from the cold, but from the weight of his stare. Her lips, blue from the chill, parted. "I am An Lee," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying a faint melodic accent that was so painfully familiar. "I am the sister of your wife." Jacob felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had known Lynn had a sister, a much younger one she had spoken of in quiet, homesick moments. A child he had always pictured, but this was no child. This was a woman. An Lee's gaze did not waver. She seemed to understand the storm raging inside him, the confusion and the shock that had rendered him speechless. "Our family, they sent me," she added, the words hanging in the frozen air between them, laden with a meaning so immense it threatened to shatter the stillness of the past 10 years. He finally found his voice, though it came out as a rough rasp. "Sent you?" He stepped back, the movement clumsy, involuntary. He was letting the heat out, letting the storm in, but he couldn't seem to command his body to do the simple act of closing the door. He couldn't close the door on her, on this echo of his past. "Please," she whispered, a plea that was not for his understanding, but simply for shelter. "The cold." The word broke through his stupor. He saw the way she trembled, the exhaustion that clung to her like a second coat. Whatever this was, whatever impossible thing was happening on his doorstep, she was freezing. He stepped aside, holding the door wider. "Come in," he said, the words feeling foreign in his own mouth. He had not invited another soul into this house since the day he had buried its heart. An Lee hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped over the threshold, bringing with her the scent of snow and a world he thought he had left behind forever. He shut the door, and the roar of the wind was replaced by a silence that was suddenly, terrifyingly, filled with a new presence. She stood uncertainly in the center of the room, her valise placed carefully on the floor beside her. Her eyes moved over every detail of the cabin, the stone hearth, the worn rug, the single lantern casting a warm, golden glow over the wooden walls. She was not just seeing a room, she was seeing her sister's life. Jacob could feel her gaze tracing the invisible lines of memory that crisscrossed the space. He watched her, a maelstrom of emotions churning within him. He saw Lynn in the way she held her hands clasped before her, a gesture of quiet deference. He saw Lynn in the slight tilt of her head as she took in the room, but the fear in her eyes was her own. The weariness etched into the corners of her mouth was her own. Toward the hearth, then turned away. Toward the hearth, then turned away, needing to put distance between them, needing to do something familiar. He went to the stove, his movements stiff. He ladled a measure of coffee grounds into the percolator, his hands working from muscle memory. The simple, domestic task was an anchor in the sudden tide that threatened to pull him under. An Lee moved toward the fire, her movements graceful and hesitant. She unbuttoned her thin coat and draped it over the back of the empty chair. Lynn's chair. The sight sent a jolt through him. She held her hands out to the flames, the firelight catching the glint of melted snow in her dark hair. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with everything unsaid. The only sounds were the crackle of the logs and the rhythmic bubbling of the coffee on the stove. He didn't know what to say. What could he possibly say? Welcome? Why are you here? Do you know you look so much like her it hurts to breathe? He settled for pouring 2 cups of coffee into tin mugs, the dark, bitter liquid steaming in the cool air. He carried them over, extending one to her. She turned, her eyes meeting his over the rim of the cup. "Thank you," she murmured. She took the mug, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was cold, but the brief contact was like a spark, a shock of life in a house that had been dormant for a decade. He retreated to his side of the hearth, leaning against the mantelpiece. He watched her sip the coffee, her gaze fixed on the flames. "How did you get here?" he asked, the question abrupt. "The stage brought me to Harmony Creek. A man there. He gave me a ride until the snow grew too deep. I walked the rest of the way." Harmony Creek was a full day's ride in good weather. The thought of her walking through this rising storm, alone, sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. "That was a fool's errand," he said, the words sharper than he intended. Her eyes flickered toward him, a flicker of hurt in their depths before it was shuttered away. "I had to come." "Why?" The word was stark, stripped of all politeness. He needed to know. He needed to understand the reason for this intrusion, for this ghost appearing at his door. Anli set her mug down on the hearthstones with a soft click. She reached into a small pocket sewn into the seam of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the edges worn and soft from handling. It was rice paper, thin and delicate, covered in columns of elegant black characters. She held it out to him. "My father wrote this for you." Jacob stared at the letter as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't want to touch it. He didn't want to read the words that would inevitably explain the impossible situation he found himself in. He knew the script. Lynn had taught him to recognize a few characters, the ones for his name, for love, for home. He could see his name near the top. This was for him. This was a reckoning he had not known was coming. He shook his head slowly. "I can't read it." "I will read it for you," she offered, her voice gentle. It was the same tone Lynn used to use when he was frustrated or tired, a softness that was meant to soothe. But coming from Anli, it felt like a trap, a gentle, inexorable closing of a circle he had no wish to complete. With a sigh that seemed to pull up all the weariness of the last 10 years, he finally reached out and took the letter. The paper was fragile in his rough, calloused hand. He didn't want her to read it. He didn't want to hear her voice speak the words that would change the landscape of his life as surely as this snow was changing the world outside. He wanted her to take the letter back, to take her valise, and to disappear back into the storm, leaving him to his quiet, orderly grief. But he knew she couldn't. The tracks she had made in the snow were already disappearing. The world outside was being erased, and she was here, inside his walls, a tangible fact he could no longer ignore. He sank into his own chair, the one opposite hers, and unfolded the letter. The black ink was a language of ghosts. He held it out to her. "Read it." Anli took a steadying breath, her gaze dropping to the familiar script of her father. The firelight flickered across her face, illuminating the solemn set of her jaw. She began to translate, her voice quiet and formal, a stark contrast to the storm howling outside the cabin's sturdy walls. "To the respected husband of our departed daughter," she began, each word falling into the room like a stone into a still pond. 10 years have passed in sorrow since the heavens claimed our beloved Lynn. Her memory is a treasure in our hearts, but her absence is a wound that does not heal. We have grieved for her, and we have grieved for you, left alone in a distant land without the comfort of family. Jacob's knuckles were white where he gripped the arms of his chair. He could feel the carefully constructed walls of his solitude beginning to crumble. Anli's voice remained steady, a practiced recitation that belied the turmoil he could now see in the tightness around her eyes. "It is not right for a man to be alone. It is not our way. A home must have a heart, and a hearth must have a woman to tend its flame. Our Lynn brought you honor, and you gave her a home. The bond between our families was not meant to be broken by an early winter." She paused, her own breath catching for a moment before she continued. "Our daughter, Anli, has come of age. She is of our blood, raised with the same devotion and with the same spirit as her sister was made. We send her to take her sister's place, to be your wife, to bring life back to your home and to quiet the ghosts that surely walk there." The final words fell into a deafening silence. The storm outside seemed to recede, its fury nothing compared to the tempest inside Jacob. He stared at her, his mind reeling. To be your wife. The words were an absurdity, a cruel joke. They thought they could just replace her? Like a broken tool or a lost animal? Did they think his love for Lynn, his grief for her, was something that could be transferred to another simply because she shared the same blood? A cold anger began to smolder beneath his shock. It wasn't directed at An Lee, who sat before him like a sacrificial lamb, but at the faceless family an ocean away who had orchestrated this. Who had sent this young woman across the world to a stranger's house, to a life she couldn't possibly understand? He stood up, the movement so abrupt it made her flinch. He began to pace the narrow space in front of the hearth, his boots thudding against the floorboards. No, he said, the word a low growl. No. He stopped and looked at her, truly looked at the woman and not the ghost. They had no right. An Lee lifted her chin, a spark of defiance in her eyes that was new. It is their right. It is my duty. I gave my word. Your word, he scoffed, the sound bitter. You're a child. What do you know of giving your word to something like this? I am 25, she corrected him, her voice firm. I am not a child, and I know of honor. I know of family. My sister is gone. My parents are old. They worry for you. They worry for the connection between us. This was the way. This is not the way, he countered, his voice rising. Not here. This is my home, my life. It is not a debt to be paid or a contract to be fulfilled. The snow was coming down in thick, blinding sheets now, plastering itself against the window panes and muffling the world in a blanket of white. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, a wild, untamed thing. It felt as though the world was closing in on them, trapping them in this small, fire-lit room with the impossible weight of her family's command. The storm descended in full fury, a howling white monster that devoured the landscape. The world beyond the cabin windows vanished into a churning vortex of snow. The sound was immense, a constant, deafening roar that vibrated through the log walls. Jacob, pulled from his internal turmoil by the sheer violence of the weather, moved with purpose. The argument was forgotten, replaced by the primal need to survive the onslaught. The shutters, he said, his voice tight. We need to bar the shutters. An Lee was on her feet instantly, her earlier defiance replaced by a quiet readiness. She watched him, her eyes wide but alert, waiting for direction. He moved to the main window, his hands working the familiar iron latch of the heavy wooden shutters. The wind ripped at them as he swung them closed, fighting him with an invisible brute force. He slammed the iron bar into place, and the room was plunged into a deeper dimness, the roar of the storm now slightly muffled. There's another on the north wall, he said, nodding toward the small window near the pantry. She went without a word, her movements sure and steady. He watched for a second as she struggled with the heavy bar, her slight frame straining against the weight. He crossed the room and closed his hands over hers, his larger, calloused grip guiding the bar into its socket. The contact was brief, impersonal, born of necessity, but it sent another jolt through him. Her hands were strong, capable. They were not the delicate, fragile things he had imagined. When the last shutter was barred, the cabin became a fortress, a small pocket of warmth and dim light against the elemental chaos outside. The only light came from the fire and the single lantern, which cast long, dancing shadows that made the small space feel both intimate and menacing. The roar of the wind was a constant presence, a reminder of their isolation. They were utterly alone, cut off from the rest of the world. For how long, he couldn't know. It could be days. The reality of it settled over him. He was trapped here, with her. He turned back to the fire, adding another log, the flames leaping up to lick at the fresh wood. He felt her presence behind him, a quiet weight in the charged air. The anger had subsided, replaced by a weary resignation. Pacing and shouting would change nothing. The storm had made its decision for them. "You must be hungry," he said, not looking at her. It was a statement, not a question. He moved to the pantry, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He took down a slab of salted pork, a few potatoes, and an onion. The familiar ritual of preparing a meal was a comfort, a way to impose order on a world that had spun out of his control. He worked in silence, peeling the potatoes with methodical strokes, the knife sure in his hand. An-Li did not return to her chair. She came to the table, her shadow joining his in the flickering light. "May I help?" she asked. He hesitated. This was his kitchen, his routine. For 10 years no one else had stood here. But he found himself nodding, pushing the onion and a smaller knife toward her. She began to chop, her movements quick and precise. They worked side by side in the dim light, the only sounds the rhythmic chop of their knives and the relentless howl of the storm. The shared task created a strange, unspoken truce. They were no longer adversaries in a battle of wills, but two people preparing to ride out a storm together. They ate in near silence, the stew hot and savory, a welcome warmth against the chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. The wind continued its assault, a constant, mournful cry that underscored their isolation. Jacob found his gaze drifting to her as she ate. She held her spoon with a delicacy that reminded him so fiercely of Lynn, yet her focus was entirely her own. She was here, a solid, breathing presence in the chair that had been empty for a soul-crushing decade. After the meal, she gathered the plates, her movements efficient and quiet, and carried them to the wash basin. He started to protest, to say it was his task, but the words died in his throat. What was the point? She was here. This was happening. He watched as she washed the dishes, the firelight catching the sheen of water on her hands. It was such a simple, domestic act, yet it felt monumental. It was the first time in 10 years that the sounds of his home had included someone other than himself. He sat by the fire, the letter from her father lying on the small table beside him, a silent testament to the new reality of his life. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind a hollow ache of confusion and a profound sadness. He looked at this woman, this stranger who wore his wife's face, and felt a pang of pity for her. She had been sent across an ocean, a pawn in a game of honor and duty she had been taught to play without question. She finished her task and came to stand near the hearth, drying her hands on a small cloth. She did not sit. She seemed to be waiting. "Lynn," Jacob said, the name finally breaking free, soft and ragged. "She used to hum when she was working. A little tune. I never knew the name of it." An-Li's hands stilled. She looked at him, her dark eyes filled with a sudden, deep sorrow that mirrored his own. "The Song of the Magpie," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It is about finding your way home after a long journey." The simple explanation was like a key turning a lock in his chest. A flood of memories washed over him. Lynn in the garden, her head bent over the new shoots, that little tune a soft counterpoint to the buzzing of the bees. Lynn at the stove, the same melody on her lips as she stirred a pot. He had never known what it meant, just that it was hers. "She missed them," An-Li said softly, her gaze distant. "Our parents, our village. She loved you. She wrote of you in every letter, of your kindness, of the home you built, but a part of her was always looking east." Jacob felt a fresh wave of guilt. He had known she was homesick, but he had believed his love, this life, would be enough. Perhaps it had been a younger man's arrogance. I should have done more." "You gave her a life," An-Li said, her eyes meeting his again. There was no judgment in them, only a shared understanding of the loss that connected them. "And she gave you one. But now, both are empty." Her honesty was brutal, but true. He looked around the cabin, at the shadows clinging to the corners, at the empty spaces. It was an empty life, a waiting room. He had not been living, he had been existing, tending the flame of a memory. An-Li took a small, hesitant step closer to the fire. "I do not want to replace her," she said, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. "I cannot. I know that. In my heart, I am mourning her too. She was my sister. She taught me to read. She told me stories of the stars. When she left, it was like the sun fell from my sky." Her confession cracked the stoic facade she had maintained. Tears welled in her eyes, shimmering in the firelight before tracing silent paths down her cheeks. "But I also have a duty, and I am afraid." The sight of her tears undid him. It was one thing to fight against an idea, against a duty he didn't accept. It was another to be faced with the raw, quiet vulnerability of the woman standing before him. His anger, his resistance, it all felt like a cruelty in the face of her own grief and fear. He saw not a replacement for his wife, but a young woman adrift, sent to an unknown shore with only a compass of obligation to guide her. The storm outside raged on, a physical manifestation of the turmoil that had finally breached their defenses. He pushed himself out of his chair and took a step toward her. He didn't know what he intended to do, only that he couldn't let her stand there and weep alone. He stopped a foot away from her, the space between them charged with a decade of loss and a future he couldn't comprehend. "There's nothing to be afraid of," he said, his voice softer than he had heard it in years. The words felt inadequate, a lie even, but they were all he had. She looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes searching his face. "My father said you were a good man," she whispered. "Lynn said it too. But I am a stranger here. I am not her." "I know," he said quietly. And for the first time, he fully believed it. The resemblance was a cruel trick of nature, but the person beneath it was different. The sorrow in her eyes was her own. The strength in her jaw was her own. He was beginning to see An-Li. He reached out, his hand hesitating in the air for a moment before he gently rested it on her shoulder. The fabric of her dress was coarse beneath his palm. She flinched but did not pull away. She simply stood there, trembling under his touch. We'll figure it out," he said, the words a clumsy promise to both of them. "When the storm passes." He let his hand fall away, the brief contact leaving a lingering warmth on his skin. He turned and walked toward the back of the cabin, to the door that had remained closed for 10 years. The bedroom. He needed air, or a different kind of silence. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was cold, the air still and heavy with disuse. Nothing had been changed. Lynn's clothes were still folded in the drawers of the pine dresser. A silk shawl, the one she had brought with her from her homeland, was draped over a chair. On the nightstand, a small porcelain bowl held a few dried petals from the wild roses she had loved to gather. It was a shrine, a perfectly preserved moment in time. He ran his hand over the smooth, cool wood of the dresser, his fingers tracing the grain. This was where his grief lived, in its most concentrated form. He had locked it away, thinking he could contain it. But An-Li's arrival had thrown open the door, letting it spill out into the rest of the house, into the rest of his life. He heard a soft footstep behind him and knew she had followed him. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the firelight from the other room. She did not enter, but her presence filled the space. Her gaze fell on the silk shawl, and a soft, sad smile touched her lips. "I remember when the weaver made that for her," she said, her voice a reverent hush. "She was so proud of it. The color of the sky before a summer rain," she said. Jacob picked up the shawl. The silk was cool and impossibly smooth in his rough hands. He could almost smell Lynn's scent on it, a faint trace of jasmine and rose. He turned to face An-Li, the shawl held between them like a fragile bridge. "I couldn't save her," he said, the confession torn from a place deep inside him he had kept locked away. The sickness, it came on so fast. The doctor from the creek was 2 days out. By the time he got here, he didn't need to finish. The memory was seared into his mind, the fever, the weakness, the light slowly dimming in her eyes. I sat with her. I held her hand, but I couldn't stop it. A man who can build a house, who can tame the wilderness, and I couldn't stop a fever from taking my wife. The guilt was a poison he had been swallowing for 10 years. It was his failure. He was her protector, and he had failed. An Lee took a step into the room. She reached out and gently took one end of the shawl. "It was not your fault," she said, her voice firm, cutting through his haze of self-recrimination. "Sickness is not a wild animal you can fight with your hands. It is the wind. It is fate. My mother, she lost 2 sons to the fever before I was born. It is a sorrow that visits many doors. It does not mean the man of the house was weak." She looked directly into his eyes, and in their depths he saw not pity, but an ancient, hard-won wisdom. "You did not fail her," she repeated, more softly this time. "You stayed with her. You held her hand. You did not let her face the darkness alone. That is not failure." Of grieving, of blaming himself, he had never once thought of it that way. He had focused only on the outcome, on the loss, not on the final act of devotion. He had seen his presence at her bedside as a mark of his helplessness, but An Lee was showing him it was a testament to his love. The tension that he had carried in his shoulders for a decade began to ease, a knot slowly, painfully unspooling. He looked down at the shawl, then back at her. He saw the sister, the mourner, the messenger. He saw the woman who had crossed an ocean to fulfill a duty, who had walked through a blizzard to a stranger's door, and who now stood in the heart of his grief, offering him not a replacement, but a release. The storm broke some time before dawn. The relentless howling of the wind quieted to a low moan, then fell silent altogether. The sudden absence of sound was as jarring as its presence had been. Jacob had not slept. He had returned to his chair by the fire, while An Lee had taken a blanket and curled up on the rug near the hearth, a respectable distance between them. But sleep had not come for him. He had watched the fire burn down to embers, his mind replaying her words. "That is not failure. That is love." In the quiet of the pre-dawn, the world felt new, scrubbed clean. He rose and unbarred the shutters on the main window. The sight that greeted him stole his breath. The world was transformed. A thick, immaculate blanket of snow covered everything, smoothing the hard edges of the land into soft, graceful curves. The sky to the east was a pale, pearlescent gray, tinged with the first blush of pink. The air was crystalline and still. A new day. A new world. He felt a movement behind him and turned. An Lee was awake, standing with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair was slightly mussed from sleep, and in the soft gray light she looked younger, more vulnerable. She came to stand beside him at the window, their shoulders almost touching. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the colors in the sky deepen from pink to a fiery orange. "I have not seen a sunrise like this before," she said softly. "The sun rises differently over the mountains." "It's the plains," he said, his voice quiet. "There's nothing to stop the light." He looked at her profile illuminated by the dawn. The light caught the curve of her cheek, the line of her throat. The ghost of Lynn was still there, a faint, silvery echo, but the woman standing next to him was solid, warm, and real. An Lee. He saw the courage it had taken for her to come here, the strength she held within her quiet frame. He saw the grief she carried for her sister, a grief that was intertwined with his but was uniquely her own. He saw a future he had not dared to imagine, one that was not about replacing the past, but about building something new beside it. He had spent 10 years honoring a memory. Perhaps it was time to honor a life, his own, and maybe, just maybe, hers. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cool but curled instinctively around his. He turned to face her fully. Her eyes, dark and deep, searched his, asking a question he was only now ready to answer. He raised his other hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. His thumb grazed her cheek, and her skin was soft, alive. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't move. She simply watched him, her breath catching in her throat. He closed the small distance between them and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was hesitant, gentle, and deeply tender. It tasted of wood smoke and winter air and the faint, clean scent of snow. It was a question, an apology, and a promise all at once. When he pulled back, the first rays of the sun broke over the horizon, flooding the cabin with golden light. The light seemed to wash away the last of the shadows, both in the corners of the room and in the recesses of his heart. Anli's eyes were wide, her lips slightly parted. A soft blush had risen on her cheeks, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She did not look away. In her gaze he saw not just acceptance, but a flicker of hope. A hope that mirrored the fragile, unfamiliar feeling that was beginning to blossom in his own chest. The kiss had not erased the past. It had not diminished the memory of Lynn, or the love he would always carry for her. Instead, it felt as though it had made a space for something new to grow alongside it. The house no longer felt like a tomb. With Anli standing here, bathed in the morning sun, it felt like a home again. A home with the potential for warmth, for laughter, for life. He was still holding her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "The path to the barn will need to be cleared," he said, his voice steady. "The cattle will be hungry." It was a simple, practical statement, a return to the rhythms of life, but beneath it was an unspoken acknowledgement. We are here. Life goes on. We will face it together. Anli nodded, a small, shy smile finally gracing her lips. "I can help," she said. They spent the morning working, a comfortable silence settling between them. He shoveled a path through the deep snow, his muscles straining with the familiar work. She followed behind him, carrying buckets of feed for the animals. The world was quiet, the only sounds their breathing in the cold air, the crunch of snow under their boots, and the lowing of the cattle. When the work was done, they returned to the cabin. The air inside was warm and smelled of coffee, which he had set to brew before they went out. He took her snow-dusted coat and hung it by the fire to dry. She watched him, her expression thoughtful. "This was her chair," she said, gesturing to the seat she had taken the night before. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. Jacob looked at the chair, then at his own. For a decade they had been a monument to what was lost. "Yes," he said, "it was." He walked over to the table where they had eaten their meals in silence and intention. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the one he had occupied for 10 lonely years. Then he pulled out the one beside it. He looked at Anli. "But we can sit where we please." A new understanding passed between them. It was not about erasing Lynn, but about making new spaces, new traditions. It was about allowing the present to exist without being constantly overshadowed by the past. He ladled stew into 2 bowls and placed them on the table. He sat, and after a moment's hesitation, Anli took the seat beside him. They ate, not as strangers bound by a reluctant duty, but as 2 people who had weathered a storm together and had come out the other side into a world that was quiet, bright, and filled with possibility. The silence was no longer heavy with grief, but full of unspoken promises, of a future yet to be written. The fire crackled in the hearth, the sun streamed through the window, and for the first time in 10 years, Jacob felt the stirrings of peace. He was not alone.